Classes in Wargame Design, a series of lectures based on George Philly's book, Designing Board Wargames, Introduction, to be available from Smashwords.com and Amazon Kindle. And today, Lecture 10, Teaching Design, Counters, Maps, Part 1.
Good afternoon. So where are we? We have finished our discussion of Stalingrad. The students in the class are actually trying to play the game with mixed results, given that none of them have ever played it before. And we are going to now advance on from Stalingrad. First, I'm going to finish off the discussion of last time about playtesting and things one would put into an academic course. And then I will advance to talk about units and map gridding. I'm not sure we'll finish map gridding today, but we'll at least make a dent in it. The first question is, well, it's nice to say we have the set of rules as to how you do playtesting and game design, and these are rules that have been evolved for a board war game. There are some substantial differences between board war game design and computer design. You may notice that the art aspects got started very late towards the end, after the game has been completely designed. The rules aspects, the rules can get changed fairly substantially at a late phase. There are no software aspects because there is no software in the normal sense. So the issues are quite different. Observe that a board war game is much more flexible than a computer game is, in the sense that if we are partway through or much of the way through the project and we don't like some major issue, we can trash it and the sunk costs are relatively modest. If you told me I was doing a computer game and there were 4 or 5 superheroes and close to the end we decided that one of the superheroes didn't work, suddenly all of the art development is down the drain, or is carefully saved for someplace else. But for a board war game, gee, we dumped this unit counter. The cost. You see, there's a difference here. Okay, having said that, let us consider what is going to happen in an academic course if we try to teach game design. And I'm going to be talking primarily about my practical experience based on teaching Eurogame design based on my 2 books, Designing Modern Strategy Games and Modern Perspectives on Strategy Games. Contemporary perspectives, I mean. In any event, there are a couple issues that are a little different than in doing a conventional game. First of all, there is a very fixed time schedule. You have the start of the term, you have the end of the term, and whatever starts here has to finish when you get here. And so at the point we get into the playtesting cycles, there are very rigid, fixed schedules as to the playtesters must have their notes ready on day 1. The people who are looking at it must send responses on day 2, and on day not very many further forward must have the next iteration of the game, because the lab in which the games are playtested meets at a fixed day at a fixed time. And so you are locked into schedule. Now, if I am doing some other sort of game and I want to release it in time for Christmas, there really is a fixed set of dates, and there is a point at which catastrophe is imminent if you don't get things to the disk burning site on time. But until you get there, if you are still back here someplace where you are trying to develop the game, if the playtesters take an extra day, or the coders need an extra day, or someone finishes something sooner, nothing much goes wrong. In an academic circumstance, the schedule is very rigid, and you sort of have to hold the stark fist of failure over the students. If you don't make a scheduled point, if you don't return your playtester notes on time, etc., life is going to be very bad. The next point I would make on an academic course is that there are a few things that you can do that are not quite game design but are important. When I teach our game design course, I am rather emphatic that every student will keep a design notebook. And the notion of the design notebook is that you sit there and jot notes on what you are doing, and at the end of the term, it is going to be turned in and graded. But what I point out to students is that if you have a design notebook which can include artwork, this is something you can use to sell yourself to people who conceivably would want to hire you. This is particularly true for students in an art track where you can't point at software. And if your notebook shows the assignments you had in a few classes not done very well, that says something. And if the notebook has this beautiful color perspective drawing of a leaf seen from above, well, that's very nice. Except on the next page, it's the leaf seen from below, and the leaf seen from below is a camouflaged micro-mecha with gun ports all over the place. If you're doing things that clearly had nothing to do with your classwork because you actually like doing your work, you are in much better shape. My late friend, the good Sid Saxon, kept notebooks for his entire career. And they were very detailed, and they were all sorts of, here is the idea, that is the idea. These are paper notebooks. After all, they go back to the 50s. There weren't computers in our sense in the 50s. And in the back, he very carefully indexed all sorts of things. So if there was a game by a name, there would be the name. And if the game had some unique movement rule, there would be something in the back so he could look up what page to look on in the notebook. And these detailed notebooks and his huge collection of conventional board games, he had about 20,000 of them in his house. Every room was filled with games, including shelves down the middle of every room. His huge collection of games meant he had all sorts of details and ideas at his fingertips. What I'm trying to do in my books, by the way, is to replace the huge cat armamentarium arsenal of games with something where you can look up ideas or find ideas and not have to work through the entire game library to find something. So that's the design notebook. Now, some design notebooks are better than others, and I have had design notebooks which were actually several notebooks filled with all sorts of notes on several role-playing campaigns, rules, this, that. I have had notebooks that were more or less completely blank, or in which the student was taking notes on fellow students they might want to carry on with. This is not an approved classroom activity. You get the general idea. Finally, we have playtesting. In the real world, you try to do as much playtesting as possible, and you may have one group of playtesters on one schedule and another on another. In the classroom, you're sort of stuck. You line students up into groups that are the same size as the group of people who are going to play the game, because the way you playtest is we have the lab section, we have a student group, a student group, a student group, a student group, and they trade games. And they then do playtesting of each other's games, and you arrange things so that different groups playtest each other's games, and you don't have the same group playtesting repeatedly. However, we're on a fixed schedule. The way things work, we really only have 3 sessions of playtesting. It's a 7-week course. The first 4 weeks of labs are filled with exposing people to different types of Euro games. And then we hit the 3 playtesting sessions. And so in session 1, 4-student group, one of the students walks off with their game to another group and teaches the other group how to play. Now, there may be written rules and handouts and such, but one of the people in the original group is sitting there helping to play the game and taking detailed notes on everything that didn't work or did work. The next day, within a day or two, the playtesting groups are required to write up their reports and give them to the game design group and give me a copy so I can see this got done. And a few days later, the game design groups have to have done their iteration redesign and present the new game to the next playtesting group. So if we have a Wednesday lab, by Friday the game design reports are due. By the next Monday, the revised games are due because the games have to be handed to the next playtesting group so they have time to playtest it, read the rules, and be ready to play. There are a few things I try to get across to playtesting groups that don't always work equally well. One important point is you are trying to test the game. You are not trying to win the game. These are not the same thing. And pursuing a single optimal strategy as opposed to seeing what happens if you do odd things will occasionally lead to poor playtesting. There's a similar issue arises in computer games where you want people to do low probability events, so you discover in advance that there's a small coding error, and if the player presses the control and print screen key at the same time, in addition to moving forward a move, you erase the hard drive. This would be viewed as a negative game feature, I would think. Well, some people would argue. So we have week 1 where someone plays. Then in week 2, the expectation is the group playing the game can pass written questions to the design group, and under normal conditions, the questions are written and specific and go back and forth. And then week 3, we have the final play test, and the expectation, which is not always met, is that the group doing the playtesting will not need to ask any major questions of the group who designed the game. And then the group who did the playtesting submits their final corrections, and a few days later I am given the final version of the game with all of the playtest comments from round 3 and the answers of the design group. Now there's several other things that can go wrong, especially in board wargaming. In a board wargame, content is important. In Eurogames, content sort of fits in color as color. It's an aspect of the games. How do you develop color? Well, if it's a pirate game, you might decide to rent a copy of Pirates of the Caribbean or Cutthroat Island. If it's a vampire game, you might rent the Vampire Nostradamus series. On the other hand, if you were serious, you could take Harlan's Seamanship and break down the discussion of how to take a sailing ship, a square rigger, across the wind into 10 or 15 paragraphs of detailed rules. That would be a very fine-grained game. But the notion is, in Eurogames, the color is somewhat limited in terms of how accurate it has to be. In a board war game, the color, the historical content is much more important, and you can get design groups that will look at your historical data and disagree with you and send you a revised game. And instead of playtesting your game, they designed a new one. And their information is basically useless as playtesting, however fond they are of their technical detail on whatever. Now, I've said we have described this in terms of the course where we have a lab, and at fixed times we have 3-hour playtest sessions, and superposed on top of this is the strict rule: you must either have a game that plays in an hour and a half so it can be played twice, or a game that plays in 2.5 hours, because long games tend to fluctuate more in their length, so that at the end of 3 hours you're done. In order to do this, the design group has to really do their own playtesting, either with friends or each other, off camera, to have the game up and ready. Occasionally this leads to difficulty. One of my favorite exam questions on the final goes, who are the members of your design group? It's remarkable how many people don't realize that human beings in America have last names. How did you do playtesting? What did you think worked or not worked? And I had one notorious case. Designer 1. I and my 2 other design partners did lots and lots of playtesting. The game worked perfectly every time. And player 2 said, I kept telling the other two guys in my group that we should really try playing the game once, but they said I was wrong. Player 3, I had to supply the answer for, because his answer was, I dropped out of the course in week 2 and haven't been here since. And then the design went to the playtesters, and the final group of playtesters said, here are a list of rules that make no sense in the English language sense. Here are some issues that lead to totally unplayable results. Response, all written by designer 1. My playtesters are stupid, lazy, and incompetent. The game is perfect. Unfortunately for them and me, I had to try to set up and play this thing. The playtesters were very good. The first designer left something to be desired. So this is playtesting. The constraints of a course are very different than the constraints of a game design shop. There is no room for what happened with Avalon Hill Africa Core, which was shelved for some months, and then Tom Shaw had his brilliant idea, it really was brilliant at the time, the automatic victory attack, and automatic victory meant that certain bad play features went away. Maybe the game wasn't quite perfect yet, but there were a few other changes made, but the game had to sit. Ditto, in Puerto Rico, the notion that every player played the same role when someone chose a role card was not in the original design, and the game didn't work until it was added. And sometimes games, like good wine, need time to mature. So those are my comments on teaching the game design course and how you do playtesting in an academic environment, which is not quite the same as the real environment, but there's some lessons there. Let us, however, now push ahead and talk a bit more systematically about unit counters and maps. There is a short chapter on unit counters. The major issue is, in a traditional unit counter, a square of cardboard, it could be a rectangle, and if you have a game in which the competing units are Grecian phalanxes, which have a long side and a short side that are functionally very different, or if you have lots of other periods where units lined up shoulder to shoulder over large distances, well, that makes sense. But the traditional counters are square, and the orthodox counter will have a block here which gives information about the unit. Now in Stalingrad, the contents of that block are basically meaningless. The combat factors tell you everything. The block is decorative chrome. Nonetheless, there are standard NATO unit symbols. I've supplied a stack of these which show what the sorts of units you have. So you have, for example, infantry, cavalry, armor, it's a cannonball, artillery, paratroops, and you can go down the list. There are lots of different sorts of symbols. Only some of these are found in Stalingrad. Here are engineers. It looks like a bridge. Depending on period, there will be various other sorts of units. For example, if you are a British army of about 1814 or 1812, you may have, that is in fact rocket artillery. The rockets were Congreve rockets. Congreve rockets were quite effective against small targets like cities, and if you could fire 40,000 of them, which the British did against Copenhagen, small numbers of rockets, Congreve rockets, or even the improved Hale rockets were mostly left something to be desired. Nonetheless, there are all sorts of unit types. And up here, we have a designator that tells you how big the unit is. And so there is one man. And there's what is usually called a fire team, squad, and those are little circles, platoon, company, battalion, regiment, brigade. Those aren't really exactly different. Division, and I have been doing it in this sequence, so we will finally reach Stalingrad, which are corps. This keeps going. Now, those labels are slightly less unambiguous than it sounds. For example, the Russians had what they called divizia, but a Russian armored divizia was really a brigade. It was a brigade in size, it was a brigade in deployment, it was a brigade in use. A Roman legion was a respectably large, in period, all weapons classes unit. That is, it was basically the same as a modern division. The division is the smallest object that usually has more or less all types of units. There may be, if you have a corps, extra units, extra artillery battalions or whatever, but a division has something of everything. The Roman legion had something of everything, but it was really only 5,000 men. It was the size of a healthy regiment. If you go back to the American Civil War, there were things they called regiments and brigades, but they didn't. The same word was being applied to something quite different. And if you said these are large companies and large battalions, that's more what it was. Saying battalion will, of course, cause the Civil War historians to foam at the mouth because the word wasn't uniformly used in that period. In any event, you have all of these symbols on the units. Now, having said you have symbols on the units, you also have the notion of doing a color scheme. You also have the important feature that every unit counter has two sides, front and back. If you were doing this on computers, you could easily have more sides than that. For example, if you wanted a computer representation of a block game, a reasonable computer representation, the unit counters would have 5 sides, all square, and one or the other of them would count. However, saying you have 2 sides, you could now have a front side which shows nothing except, say, a color telling you which country it was, or color and an arrow telling you which way the unit is facing. That's 1914. And the back has all of the numerical data. There are lots of game systems that are exactly as I have just told you. Well, it's a color, and now we come to a couple of issues. And the first issue, I've talked about some of this before, is that you like the background color and the printing color to have a lot of contrast. Yellow ink on a green background is a particularly unfortunate choice. It's very hard to read. Black ink on light pastels works well because that's how the human eye works. There was a game company once upon a time. Their units had counters had 2 sides, and the front side basically showed the uniform of each regiment. Now, these were Napoleonic regiments, so there was a coat, and there was a jacket, and there was a shirt, and there were trousers, and there was a belt, and there was a hat. Those are all different colors, and there were little blobs of color. And if you looked hard, there were little dots. And the little dots represented the metal out of which the uniform buttons were made. Now, the problem with this was that in period, people were not very uniform or systematic in uniform colors, and each regiment might or division or whatever might have a different uniform with different color schemes. And so you had this montage of very different units, and you had to work fairly hard to be sure you hadn't picked up and moved the other side's units to attack him with, because the color schemes could be quite close. Of course, you could have been so lucky that you drew it was a Napoleonic regiment, the Canaries. So called because the uniform was bright yellow with red piping. It was very pretty, very easy to see at a distance, but it was the Canaries. The other aspect of unit counters, which is of some significance, is that unit counters are going to be physically handled. If you try to use thin paper slips, you will fail. The reason you will fail is that if you have a thin paper slip or a stack of them and try to pick up the top one, you will simply be unable to separate it with your fingernails or whatever from the other units. What you have to do is to print the unit counters in the end, or glue them onto respectably thick cardboard. The cardboard has to be good quality cardboard that's very uniform in thickness. If the cardboard is seen from the side, looks jaggedy, when you try to stack several of these, this is a side view, you get problems, namely the stacks fall over. Stalingrad, of course, only has 3 high stacks. 1914, the next game we're talking about, actually does not have stacking limits. And therefore, you, on paper, could produce a single, extremely large stack holding your entire army. This would be a really bad idea. But you could. It's in the rules. So, the unit counters really have to be nice and square, and if they roll down slightly at the edges, they're good. And if they're cut out of cardboard, there is a standard issue where here is a unit counter, and if you're not careful when you cut it, the corners tend to be a bit jaggedy. That's very bad. So I've now talked about unit counters a bit. In designing unit counters, it is correct to recall that a certain modest fraction of the human race has hypochromatism. They're partially colorblind. Most people who have the condition are men, and it's mostly red-green color blindness. The traditional Avalon Hill choices, baby pink and robin's egg blue, are sort of optimal choices. If you need a third color, pale green is good. Pale yellow would also work, but it was not what was done in period. So I've sort of said a bit about unit counters. There's a chapter on it. A lot of it we've talked about in an earlier point. And now we advance to maps. The basic issue is we have military units. Except for fortresses, which are parked, almost all military units on the map board are able to move. And the question is how you generate the allowed movement distances. What was done in traditional miniatures play, going back as far as H.G. Wells, is that I have a unit counter, which is actually a toy soldier here. I put down my ruler. I count off 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 inches, and I move the unit to the new location. Now, if the rule is we're cavalry, we're charging, we contact when the base, the square on which the unit is cemented, comes in contact with the other base, there are conditions under which life can become very unpleasant. Namely, if I have a 5-inch move, it really matters whether the enemy units were 4 7/8 or 5 1/8 inches away. And if the person moving is in a competitive game, there will now be a debate Well, did you really move that unit 5 1/8 inches as opposed to the legal 5 inches? And you notice this becomes quite ugly, and since you've moved the units, it's hard to prove what did or did not happen. What is done in board games and in some miniatures games is to say, we will resort to gridding. So here is a nice square grid, and a unit is clearly in one square or in a different square, and if I say this unit has a movement factor of 3, 1, 2, 3, it is unambiguous that I moved integer 3 squares. That whole set of arguments is eliminated. However, there are certain practical and technical issues with saying we are going to use a grid. And the first issue is that the grid, no matter how you do it, tends to disrupt the play of the game. Simplest case, this is a square grid. I'll start down here. I could move 1, 2, 3 this way, or 1, 2, 3 that way. But you notice this is the hypotenuse of a right triangle, of a right triangle. This is one of the two legs. The two legs are the same lengths, and therefore the distance I moved here is 41% greater than the distance I moved in a straight line. G, the geometry has been distorted. The armies march faster to the northwest than they do to due north. This is not a known phenomenon. And therefore you sort of say, well, that didn't work too well. So one answer, which goes back to actually the Rand Corporation in the early 1950s. There are a few photographs of this. And it goes back to board war games, something like Avalon Hill D-Day, was you replace the squares with hexagons. Now there are people who will be happy to tell you that a hex grid has no distance distortion. And if the units all move one square, in some sense that's true, but in fact this distance and that distance, they're both 2 hexes. 1, 2, 1, 2. Those two distances are unequal to each other. In fact, the difference in the distance is something like 14%. Roughly speaking. You can find people with different opinions on exactly how you reckon that distance. But the net result is, even with a hex grid, there's distortion. Now you can do more clever things. Here's a square grid. But we are going back to the MIT SGS game, Strategy 1, which appeared in their magazine, The Tank, in about 1966. Watch. 2, 4, 7, 10, 13, 15. You pay 2 movement points to move horizontally, 3 movement points to move diagonally, and this step was called 15 instead of 14.1. This is an error of less than 9%. You can do the same thing with hexagons. The issue that is raised with hexagons, and there are some nice pictures in the Sabin book, which is worth consulting, is that I'm going to have to add some more hexagons here. How are we going to describe this? If I do a move along here and keep going a bit, or if I do a move like this, the two distances are in fact the same number of hexagons. That is, if I say start here, I've moved 1, 2, 3, 4. I could also have gone 1, 2, 3, 4, and those two moves are the same. And in one case I'm weaving back and forth, in the other case I'm moving in straight lines. The two distances are said to be the same. However, they're really not the same. They differ by about 14–15% or something like that. And this has an interesting design feature. Here we are flying bombers out of Britain to reach targets in Germany. And we can either go like this, that's following the hex grid in a sort of straight line, or we can go like this, along a rank of hexes and then along a file, and they're the same number of hexes. However, this path means I avoid all of the anti-aircraft and fighters. It was not done in the real war because, in fact, it's 14% more miles, and period bombers were pushing the limits of their range with some regularity. How do we break this? Well, one answer, this is discussed, in fact, it's a homework problem, which I haven't assigned it, is to say that you pay, for example, 5, and if you keep changing your direction, you pay 5 movement points. And if you continue in the straight direction, you pay 6 movement points. And therefore, this suddenly costs more movement points than this. That is, you charge different number of movement points, and the movement point cost is determined not only by what square you're going into, but what the previous move was, the previous square of the move was. So that's an alternative. So I've talked a bit about grids. Now let us consider what grids are available. I mean, the basic issue is we have a map, and we would like to break it, the pretty map, into gridded features so we can determine movement, and we can determine where units are, and if we determine where units are, we can determine which units can attack which other units. Okay, well, the simplest solution is squares. And the original, Charles Roberts' original game, Tactics, 1953, actually uses squares. They're transparent, they're clear, yes, there's some distance distortion, but movement distances were limited to 5 or 7 squares, so the distortion wasn't too bad. And so we would break the game, we break things up. Now, one thing you could do to say we will eliminate the distance distortion is to say that diagonal moves are not allowed. And if you do not allow diagonal moves, this becomes 3, 6 instead of 4.2, and eliminating the diagonal move changes somewhat the distortion. You should realize, however, that if you aren't allowed diagonal moves, it suddenly takes 2 movement points to get here and 4 movement points to get there. And if you have a very slow unit that has a movement factor of 2 or 3, as opposed to something that is a 4 or a 6, it can take a while for that unit to get any place. So the net result is we had squares. The other choice, we saw this in Stalingrad, and other choice, was hexagons. And hexagons give you a nice set of points, and you move from hexagon to hexagon. The distortion is much less dramatic. So that's a second choice. There are several people who have done octagons. Now you may say, how do you get, why octagons? What's the significance here? Well, here is a square grid, and what I will do is to take each vertex and expand it into a little square. Now, why are little squares significant? Well, if back here you want to say you're forbidding diagonal movement, the little squares eliminate the question of whether you can get from here to there, namely this object. You notice it's now an octagon, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 sides. This octagon and that octagon are not adjacent to each other. There was at one point a game based on the Battle of, I believe it was Breitenfeld, in which the Spanish tercios were represented by unit counters that were slightly not square. They had these little prongs sticking out, and the little prongs meant that you couldn't stack them next to each other, which was historically accurate. There were huge pike lumps, and the pike lumps had to stand a certain distance apart or odd things would happen. Do we have other choices? Well, I'll mention one. You remember these are hexagons? Suppose we dissect the hexagons. I have now broken the hexagons up, those lines meet, into equilateral triangles. If you look at the equilateral triangles, adjacent equilateral triangles point in opposite directions. But that's a dissection. Actually, we have somewhat run out of time, so I will finish our discussion of map dissections next time. In that case, we are at an end. Class is over.